You should have already been made aware by the materials that you've looked over in Canvas before coming to class about negative space. That negative space is the space or the air around the positive objects. So for instance, in this example, you can see that the negative shapes or negative spaces are right here between her upper arm and her lower arm, and then here between this arm and the rest of her body, in here. And it doesn't have to be, a negative space doesn't have to be defined by a closed space. It also means the air around, so this all could be considered negative space. Don't look at this guy, he's not a part of this example. Okay. So why negative space is important is it's part of making a composition a better composition. So obviously we're all drawn to the positive things in an image because that's the action, that's the thing that we're looking at. Nobody cares about air or background, right? So in composition, we want to make sure that as we're arranging the positive spaces on our drawing paper, that we're also being cognizant of the negative spaces and how those spaces can be interesting also. So what that means is, and we're going to talk about composition later, but what that means is if this is your drawing paper, you might have a positive object here and a positive object here, which is nice, but it's boring because you have all of this boring negative space where there's nothing happening and there's nothing going on. But if you create negative spaces that are more interesting, so like that, or even now this background that is a negative space has become more interesting because it's a more interesting shape, whereas before it was just floating around. So as you're composing and as you're drawing, look for compositions, if you're using your viewfinder or not, but look for compositions where you're aware of the negative spaces also, because they're just as important as the positive spaces to make a drawing interesting. The other thing about negative space is it can help you draw more accurately. And so this goes back to drawing on the right side of the brain, where our brain has been so bombarded by visual stimuli our whole lives, and we always put names to those things. So for instance, when we're in elementary school and someone says draw a tree, how many of you guys drew this kind of broccoli looking tree? Like most of you do. So when we think of trees, we think of a symbol of a tree. But what thinking on the right side of the brain does is it changes the way that you think so that we don't think of symbols anymore. We are actively looking at the things that are in front of us. So what that means is if I think of this as an arm, it might be okay to draw. But if I just think of it as, I'm going to draw this weird negative shape and I'm going to focus on exactly what these lines are doing and the proportion and the balance between this section of the negative space versus this section, and how this gets skinny and this gets fatter and wider as it goes up. If I'm paying attention to what that negative shape is doing, then all of a sudden I already have the edge of the arm, the edge of the leg, and the edge of the torso. All of that was done without me thinking about this is the side of her breast, this is the side of her side, this is the side of her thigh, right? So if you can focus on the negative spaces just as much as you do the positive spaces, then you're going to draw more accurately.